A huge proportion of international rugby players grew up on farms. Some of Ireland's finest, like Tadhg Furlong, Rory Best, CJ Stander, just to name a few, as well as players from other nations such as David Pocock and Mike Williams. Some of the largest and most powerful people to play the game are from these agricultural backgrounds, and this is no coincidence. Welcome back to Seek Strength, and today we're talking about physical labour and its effect on our strength, structure and fitness. Everyone has heard the old phrase about old man strength or farmer strength. This certainly isn't just some old wives' tale or some lamented call of the non-athletic among us. But why is this? How are they so much bigger and stronger than everyone else? And who else falls into this bracket? So to deal with the latter first, we see similar alterations and adaptations in almost all cohorts where physical labour is present from a young age. So bricklayers, scaffolders, carpenters, heavy machine operators, the list goes on, all display the structural changes of people who work hard for a living. Larger than normal hands, thick joint structure around the knees, ankles, wrists and elbows, and generally they'll hold higher levels of muscle mass than general populations will. So let's dive into this. Those of us who prescribe exercise for a living, whether that's S&C coaches, sports coaches, healthcare practitioners or researchers, will almost always categorize exercise across 4 domains: frequency, intensity, time and type. This categorization system is referred to as the FITT principle. Frequency refers quite simply to how often you're training, in inverted commas, or exercising. In this case, we can actually group frequency and time together. It'll just make some of those calculations a bit easier. For the majority of us, a frequency of 3 to 4 times per week of physical exercise is absolutely sufficient and will garner great results. But when we look at the physical labour jobs, the frequency skyrockets. So if you do a physically demanding job, then you are realistically training these specific traits each day you work. If you're farming, you work every single day, so 365 days per year, you are enacting a stimulus for adaptation. So let's look at bone mass in the hand as an example for this. The bone mass in the hand is stimulated to increase when undue loads are placed upon it. Lifting bales, pushing trailers, throwing bags of ration are all providing this stimulus. These are things which are being done all day, every day. This level of stimulus simply cannot be replicated in a prescribed training environment. The other thing you must think about is the years when this is happening. Many people who work jobs that are physically laborious do so from quite a young age. Whether you start a blocklaying apprenticeship at 16, 17 or 18, you're still going to have a full decade of work done by your late 20s, and most importantly, much of this decade will have been while you're still naturally developing and finishing out your adolescence. So if you consider a 40-hour work week to be somewhat standard, and for argument's sake 70% of your week was spent actually handling blocks, that's 28 hours per week for 48 weeks per year for 10 years. That's nearly 13,500 hours of physical labour. This of course holds true even more so for farmers. Farming is somewhat a unique profession in the fact that almost no one becomes a farmer if they have not grown up on or around a farm, due to the massive costs of owning a farm, the necessary institutional knowledge needed, and the hard nature of the work. Farming is almost always an inherited profession. So now, if you grew up on a farm, you wouldn't have been working full-time physical jobs all year round, but you certainly would have done a few hours every day, before or after school, and you would have accumulated a massive amount of work during the school holidays. So now, by the time you're in your mid to late teens, conveniently also the time when most professional rugby selection occurs, you have tens of thousands of hours of hard physical work built up, so frequency is certainly a massive contributing factor to the adaptation we see. Intensity then is next. So intensity can simply be viewed as just how difficult an exercise is to complete. It can be manipulated through weight on a barbell, necessary heart rate in a particular working piece, pace of running, restrictions of rest periods. The ways we can manipulate intensity is almost endless. So what about the intensity levels of physical labour? Well, there's a couple of interesting things to look at here. Firstly, when you're doing physically laborious jobs, you don't want the intensity to be high. You want to be as efficient a worker as possible, Sure, a block layer could carry 4 blocks at a time, but they would undoubtedly end up burning their back out, hurting their arms, and then have to take longer breaks in between runs. It's much more efficient to carry 1 or 2 blocks at a time, not wear yourself down, and then be able to do this repeatedly, day after day, year on year. Mechanics will opt to use an impact wrench almost every chance they get, rather than using a spanner to undo stubborn nuts and bolts. And forestry workers will always favour a chainsaw or a power saw over an old style axe or handsaw. But what we do see happening is a creep in intensity as an individual grows into the role. The first year apprentice probably can't climb a ladder with a full bucket of plaster right away, but you can be sure that they'll be able to do it within a few months or years of starting. In these cases, we see the level of intensity starting quite low, then building up to a required point and rarely pushing beyond this. Finally then, we have type. So the type of exercise is typically viewed as either cardiovascular or strength work or power work or skill based, or more aptly we can start looking at the type of exercise in terms of energy system usage during it. In the case of long-term labour, we categorise this work as moderately or occasionally glycolytic, so occasionally burning carbohydrates, but mainly oxidative, so running our body on fat stores as much as we possibly can, using those mitochondria within the cell to process oxygen and then push ourselves or fuel ourselves with that. So for the vast majority of the time, labour is being fueled by fat stores and some carbohydrate. And then when the big push is needed, the carbohydrate reserves are dumped in, they're really burned primarily. For this reason, we see people being able to work for hours on end without fear of fatigue and ensuring they can repeatedly perform tasks as needed. So where do we go from here? Well, there are some key takeaways I think you should draw from this. If you see a lumberjack swinging an axe and he's jacked, don't think that you chopping some firewood at the weekend is going to have that effect on you. Most of this morphological adaptation is being driven by the sheer amount of volume and the high frequency being done. Secondly, you should really consider the importance of the age where the work is being done. It seems as though the cohort who starts this physically demanding work earlier will garner greater results than those who start in adulthood. So if you're looking to bring about some of these adaptations, whether you want to be bigger, whether you want to be stronger, whether you want to be just more physically robust, if you're already in adulthood, it's probably not the best idea to use kind of large form physical labour to get there. A more specific training program would probably be a better way of going. Lastly then, I think it would be remiss of me not to poke into the genetic component here, and particularly epigenetics. If your parent was a farmer, then they would have constantly been pushing for greater expression of the genes related to strength, size, robustness, etc. And so this endless cycle of genetic expression and transcription will lead to a genetic code that is more apt for farming or more apt for physical labour. This then, when converted into a child in the next generation, will produce a child who is already primed for this life of hard work prior to any actual physical stimulus being induced. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks as always for tuning in, and we'll see you all again soon.